Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what we were talking last time. I don't remember. That's why I'm asking. Neredeydik? Yeah, we have passed through the Cartesian exposition of the world. What's interesting in all this was that, okay, this is interesting for us, not for everybody, of course, but for us, because as members of the university, you know, our problem is not to live through the world. Our problem is to know the world, okay? This is an interesting problem simply because, you know, actually, this problem has been generalized throughout the modernity, attributed to each and every individual human being. You know, they suggested that every human being, the primary first task of every human being is to know the world. Okay. In these postmodern times, or whatever you like to call these times, okay, we rather not to do this, okay? We come to think that, okay, perhaps, for the overwhelming majority of the people living in the world, okay, knowing may not be the first problem, okay? Actually, that was why Descartes entitled his philosophy as the first philosophy, okay? The first philosophy dealt with the problem of knowing the world, okay? His basic, major problem was to know. To know, first of all, his own existence. The eyes, that interesting eye, okay? We will come back to it several times, okay? The eye, supposed to know the world, okay? To know its existence. There were two problems, you know? Is my existence, to know, I need to know my existence. Nowadays, we come to think that, or begin to think that, no. For the overwhelming majority of the people, this problem is not important. People just live their lives, okay? And to be able to live a life, it's not necessary to know. Okay? Perhaps a modified position, you can say, okay? But in those days, it started, the whole problem started with the question of knowing. And the first point of this knowing was to know that you yourself exist, okay? And the second problem, this problem for modernity has been overcome successfully by Descartes' analysis, fine, all right. But another problem, the second problem, remains to be unsolved, unfortunately, haunting us even today, okay? That problem was to know the world, not to ourselves, but to know the world, the others, the other things, okay? Again, let me say this, okay? This may not be a concern for the overwhelming majority of the people, but for us, for the members of the university, okay? For the students of sociology, for the faculty staff of sociology, for those who claiming to know, to learn, or to develop the knowledge of something, okay, it turns out to be still one of the major problems, okay? Put aside the question of existence, existential questions, so on and so forth. But we want to know things, okay? We want to know how society functions, etc., how individuals, let me use that strange term, behave in the presence of others, etc., okay? So, this problem of knowledge, a strange problem, let me say, okay, enforces upon us certain strange things, okay? First of all, to be able to even pose the problem itself, okay, one has to pose one's own existence as different from the existence of the others, you know. We came to the Cartesian, the same Cartesian dualistic worldview, so to speak, okay. I myself as scientist am having the task of knowing you, for instance, okay. So in this proposition, what happens, strangely, in a rather magical fashion, is this. The very separation of the knower and the things to be known. Okay? But again, let me say this. Okay? We came to realize nowadays that this particular separation perhaps should rather be considered within the framework of the question of knowledge. Okay? Not within the framework of the question of existence. Okay? These two things have been now separated, you know. But as we have seen in the modern times, early modern times, even at the beginning of Enlightenment, in Cartesian writings, etc., such separation did not happen yet. Okay? Now, this separation has been enforced upon us by somebody else who has been called as the last thinker of the Enlightenment. Okay? He lived at about, or wrote at about the end of the 18th century, so to speak. Okay? The person I'm talking about is Immanuel Kant. Okay? That man was a strange man, actually, being under the influence of both Cartesian and Newtonian impacts. Okay? Suddenly waking up, as what he calls it, his slumber, okay, by certain propositions developed earlier by a certain David Hume. Okay. Now, this separation, this is a strange separation, as I told you earlier. Okay, bookmark. Okay. So, the Cartesian world, I think, therefore I am. Okay, that's a fine expression. But leaving open the question about the world. Okay. So the one part of the equation had been settled down in a rather undeniable fashion. I am here. Okay. But what about the world? And the strange point developed by David Hume was this. You know, up until that time, we come to think that, you know, we have seen Aristotle, for instance, who was quite fashionable throughout the late Middle Ages, so to speak, okay? Only shaken down, his position only being shaken down by the new discoveries, the age of science, starting with Galileo and so on, okay? But strangely enough, Aristotle was quite an empiricist, you know? So the science forced its way upwards against Aristotelian empiricism by holding to the Cartesian so-called rationalism. Isn't it strange? Okay? So science started in its origins by defending or basing itself upon rationalism in contradistinction to empiricism. Okay? Empiricism, or if you like, judging according to the senses, had been proved, for most of the time at least, misleading, misguiding. Okay? And for this we owe much to the Cartesian thinking, and Immanuel Kant was somebody under the very influence of the Cartesian thinking. But Cartesian thinking, you know, came with a price, you know, on two sides, on nature and on God, you know. If Cartesian thinking was valid, even though modern thinking had no intention at all to reject the existence of God, they were rather trying to defend it, okay? They put a condition, so to speak, okay? Put a condition on God's existence, okay? that God, if God exists, for sure it exists, okay, it can't be rational. Okay? And nature exists, yes, therefore it can't be irrational as well. Okay? God and nature, therefore, I said rational. Sorry, I would say irrational. God and nature has to be rational. This is required to be able to establish the very task of the Cartesian benevolent God, you know? In other words, to establish a correspondence between our knowledge and the actual existence. You may remember for Descartes, the mismatch, the difference between our knowledge and the actual existence of things can only be acceptable under one condition: error. You know, error. But if error was to be systematic, which means it was not the benevolent God here mediating between the mind and the matter, but rather an evil demon, okay, therefore leading us in rather wrong directions in a rather systematic way, okay. Okay, on that particular issue, I may be in error, and it turned out to be possible for me, it has to be turned out to be possible for me to correct that error, okay. If error is systematic, then what governs the universe is not a good benevolent God, but an evil demon systematically aiming at misleading us, okay. So once the existence of a benevolent God had been established, okay, the only fault for error remains on the shoulder of the human beings, okay? So you personally, as a person, may err on this or that occasion, okay? But this error can be corrected. So if this error can be connected, if the error is not systematic, this simply means that both God and nature has to be rational, okay? Now, herein, the modern thinking begins to differ from the religious thinking, you know. Actually, being a Catholic himself, Descartes, okay, being a Catholic himself, acknowledges the possibility of God's being irrational. Or rather, in his own language, he says that God's rationality so much exceeds human rationality that it turns out to be impossible for the human beings to penetrate into the secrets of God's rationality. Okay? By this rationality, the nature, or if you like, the God's creation, okay, turn out to be as well rational, so that one can expect a correspondence between human rationality and rationality in nature. Okay? This correspondence ensures the truth of our knowledge. Okay? Immediately following proposition is the correspondence of our knowledge and nature, and therefore what we are expecting from our knowledge is to satisfy this correspondence, okay? For instance, contemporary positive theories of knowledge, okay, based upon this proposition of correspondence. All they were saying, I am for instance talking about the Popperian theory of knowledge, okay? All they were saying is this, okay? We may not know the truth for the time being, okay? But we are working on it, and each and every step we are approaching towards it more and more, okay? Now, for instance, our knowledge stands here. Okay, write a simple statement. Water boils at 100 centigrade degree. Okay? We know that this is an approximation, okay? More or less correct sentence. Okay? Never perfectly correct, simply because for the water to boil at 100 centigrade degree, the conditions of pressure and conditions of chemical structure of the water and certain conditions of fire must all be met. Okay? So it means that when you are in a seashore, okay, the oil may not boil at 100 centigrade degree. Or when you are at the mountain peak, the boiling degree of water may be different from this. Okay? Now, observing this, what I am now, after arriving at such a general statement, observing all this, say, I rather modify my statement, you know, coming closer to the truth of things, okay, modify my statement, observing all differences. I now, under the conditions of these and that, water boils at 100 centigrade degree. Okay? Now I modified my knowledge, enabling me to approach the truth of the matter more. Okay? Our contemporary scientific, the commonsensical contemporary scientific understanding even assumes such a statement. But David Hume made an interesting contribution. He said that after that Cartesian division of the I and the world, okay, or mind and the matter, if you like, okay, he said that, okay, well, but what if the regularities that I observe in nature do not belong to the character of the things, but to the character of my mind? Okay? Let me put this in a simple formulation around his discussion of causation. Okay, this is a very interesting, actually, problem, simply because, you know, we all assume certain causation among things. We sociologists do that, even though officially we sometimes say that in sociology, constructing causal statements or hypotheses are quite difficult. Okay? Well, you know, for instance, if we take a simple example, say, low level of income. Low level of income and low level of education, for instance, causes high level of criminality. What is this? It's a causal statement. You know, I enumerated two factors causing a third factor. Okay? Without the existence of and functioning of these two factors, I would not talk about, within the framework of this statement, I would not talk about the high rates of criminality and so on. Or, our earlier example, okay? Water boils. Why? Because it has been exposed to the fire. So, fire causes the water to boil. Okay? This is a crime actually we all commit simply because, okay, there is a difficulty here. What happens in the relationship of fire and water over there? What do we assume here, asks David Hume. Okay? or in the relationship of income and education, low level of income and education, and increasing rate of criminality. Okay? What passes? Income is something, education is another something, high level and low levels are again different somethings. Okay? These two different somethings producing, affecting the generation of another something. How come? How can such a thing be possible? What do we assume as assuming causation between these factors? Actually, to put the matter short, there is some mystical proposition hidden here in this causation. Okay? We assume that something mysterious, a mystical force, so to speak, is passing from one element to the other. For instance, in our second example, within the body of water, and here, within the agency of the individual, okay, Ahmet, okay, I'm talking about Ahmet. Ahmet here is exposed to, just like water is exposed to fire, okay, is exposed to low level of income and education, therefore generating criminal behavior. Come on, man, what happens here? Our good old Ahmet suddenly falls in dire straits, okay? Poverty, so to speak. That good child of his parents turns out to be a criminal. What happens here? What kind of factor, which we hope to find in low level of income and low level of education, do penetrate into Ahmet's soul, quote unquote, turning him into a bad child from a good, beautiful, bad youngster from a good, beautiful kid? What happens here? What's this mystical force? Okay. And David Hume suggests that perhaps, actually he does not say perhaps, but rather he says that actually all systematic relations, primarily and especially that relation of causation, is nothing else than a relation which is found in our minds, belonging to our thinking rather than belonging to the relationship between the things. Okay? This was an interesting proposition. He says that simply, and this is why his philosophy is called skepticism, you know. He simply says that actually what happens out there in nature, okay, we do not know. May causation or may not. But our judgment about causation between the things is based upon our habits. Our habit of seeing the same event is followed by another same event during several times. Okay? Example. Okay? When I expose the water to the fire, water starts to boil. Okay? Or whenever rain falls, the vegetation grows. Okay? And seeing these events repeat themselves in the same sequence after and after, okay, our mind concludes that they are somehow related in a causal fashion. Okay? So causation rather belongs to my thinking, a feature of my thinking, which has been generated by the habituation of my mind, seeing the repetitive sequence of events itinerate again and again in my experience. Okay? So each and every time we see that low income and low level of education, okay, is followed by increased criminality, we then start to assume that there is somehow mystical relationship between these two previous factors functioning here in our proposition as cause, and the third factor now finding itself in our understanding or in our knowledge efforts as the effect. Okay? So cause is followed by the effect. Why? Not because, according to David Hume, there is such a relationship in nature, but because we come to experience these events or this sequence of events repeatedly. Okay? There was a very strong argument which had a great impact on thinking of Immanuel Kant. But, you know, Hume's version was called Skepticism simply because Hume concludes that the generation of such relationships, primarily the causation relationship, okay, is nothing else than the result of habit. Now, however, there's a problem with habit. Okay? Habit is something social and historical, you know, which means that if you are exposed to different set of sequences or different set of relations among the things repeating themselves, okay, so that you are acquiring a habit of these sequences, these different sequences, or these different relations among the things, then you come to develop different judgments. Okay? Not causation, perhaps. Okay? But something else, perhaps. Okay? So this means that then human knowledge turns out, human knowledge is about all these judgments, okay? And human knowledge turns out to be something capricious, okay? Left to the whims of history and society, okay? In this society and that period of time, we begin to develop such and such habits. Therefore, our thinking assumes such and such way, while in another society, other people being exposed to different set of relations, okay, develop different habits of thinking, and therefore arriving at different conclusions, so on and so forth. So, forget about the requirement of correspondence of our knowledge to the reality of the things. What we have here is sheer relativism, or if you like, sheer skepticism. Okay? Skepticism, a deep skepticism about the truth validity of our knowledge on the one hand, and on the other hand, okay, a denial of any possibility for universal generalization of any statement of knowledge on the other hand. Okay? So nobody in that regard claimed to follow David Hume. Everybody wants to establish general principles for science. Everybody, for any scientific statement, wants to claim truth validity and so on. Okay? So nobody did like to follow the premises of David Hume, just like Immanuel Kant did as well. He didn't like to follow his conclusions. But his point remained important for Kant, okay, that the relation, the attributed relation assumed to be between the things of nature may perhaps belong to our minds. Therefore, he sets for an analysis of our thinking. Okay? This he would call as transcendental idealism. Okay? You wouldn't think that the term actually misguiding for contemporary students. By transcendental, he does not refer to that which is transcendent, so to speak. Okay? In terminology of the history of thinking, transcendent refers to that which exceeds the limits. Okay? For example, according to human conditions, that which is transcendental is God. Okay? Transcendent, sorry. However, by transcendental, Kant means here, Kant means the analysis, a particular analysis, capable of penetrating beyond the spontaneous activity of the mind. Okay? You know, there was two difficulties. We have actually touched upon it when we discussed the Cartesian thinking. Okay? Thinking is something strange, you know. Actually, it cannot start. It cannot start, I said, remember, it cannot start without positing its own thinking. So thinking can only start by thinking itself, okay? Therefore, it was circular in character, I did say. But in the meantime, okay, when it starts to think other objects, when it starts to take other things as it is object, it forgets its own existence. Okay? This difficulty can be experienced by all of you. Okay? When you are thinking, really thinking about something, you forget at that moment that you are thinking. Okay? Your thinking delves into its object, so to speak, okay? Forgetting its own existence over there. Okay? That's a strange thing. Therefore, this transcendental means, okay, the ways of thinking while thinking engaged in thinking other things. Okay? So returning back onto itself. Okay? So this forgetting is brought to light once again. Okay? Thinking while thinking other things, now enforced to think itself. Okay? How am I function when I think poverty in society, in other words? Okay? How my thinking functions when I make such a proposition about low level of income, low level of education, and high level of criminality. Okay? However, as ordinary sociologists, for instance, I may well forget, okay, how my thinking functions while I am thinking to establish such a proposition and organize my data. Okay, that's the meaning of the transcendental, actually. Okay, so that Kant would delve into it. And as for the idealism, it does not mean idealism, actually, because it deals with the ideas of the mind. Okay, it's called idealism because it deals with the ideas of the mind. Okay. Otherwise, Kant was one of the first who would reject any idealist claims, as we understand the term. Okay? So, he talks about, in that regard, actually, Cartesian mind. He translates the Cartesian mind into German as Bewusstsein, okay? Which we, in English, call, or from Latin, consciousness. Actually, Bewusstsein, German term, is much more explaining, simply because it simply means being aware. The state, if you like, the state of being aware. Okay? It refers to the state of being aware, and it is transcendental because idealism because being aware deals with the ideas. It's transcendental because it will try to penetrate behind this activity of being aware to be able to bring to light its mechanisms. Okay? In other words, the question is how one comes to be aware of things. Okay? You know, that was quite important, in a rather important way, related with our second question. First question was to establish the existence of the I, or if you like here, consciousness. And the second question was to establish any solid ground for our knowledge of the world in other words. Okay? Yeah, okay. Descartes was successful in establishing that there is a thinking mind, but what about the objects making their appearance in the mind? It's idealism because now I am talking about objects appearing in the mind, okay? In other words, I'm not talking about this desk over there. I'm talking about the idea of desk over here, okay? I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about this, ideas, therefore idealism, okay? So now I'm going to present you my famous illustration, which you will follow us throughout the semester perhaps, okay? A circle. Okay, I'm going to draw it as a circle to represent that mind or consciousness. The consciousness or mind of I think, therefore I am, you know. I think, therefore I am is somehow misleading simply because I am, as a person, so to speak, is composed of a thinking mind, perhaps a soul, I don't know, a body, many relations, a certain historicity, etc., etc., okay? Deprived of all this, that I, okay, the Cartesian I, deprived of all this, simply refers to a universal mind, okay? Not the mind of a particular Erdoğan, for instance, okay? It can be conditioned in this society throughout that period of time in a rather different way, here differently, etc., etc., okay? This is an empty universal mind, what Descartes has succeeded to establish, okay? Not full of particular kind of ideas, okay? It's an empty mind, you know, that famous method he followed, doubting the existence of everything, okay? The truth of everything helps him to empty the contents of this mind, okay? What does remain is simply this empty mind, having nobody, having no place, no content, no specific feature that would help us to differentiate it from any other mind, etc. Okay? Now, however, unfortunately, now Kant begins to penetrate into the heart of the problem. Unfortunately, under usual circumstances, and even under the Cartesian enforced emptiness of the mind, okay, that mind does not remain empty. Okay? It has full of ideas, but that strange thing, don't forget, that strange thing remains there, okay? Yes, the mind has the idea of the desk, has the idea of the chair, has the idea of the body, has the idea of the existence of other people surrounding it, etc., etc., okay? But all these ideas, don't forget, belong to the mind, okay? So, the unfortunate point is that, okay, this mind, actually here Kant follows the Cartesian radical separation of mind and body, okay? The mind cannot take the body into itself as the body, okay, as such. It can only take the idea of the body inside it, okay? So in our thinking, what we are dealing with, you can be sure, now I am establishing a very severe separation, are the representations, okay? Or in Kantian terminology, actually borrowed from the ancient Greek, okay? Appearances. If you like, now I am making a dangerous proposition. If you like, all I can think of, let me put it in this way, all I can think of are not the things themselves, but only the appearances of the things as they appear to my mind. Okay? You understand this? Okay. All I think about it, all my thinking can deal with, okay, are not the things themselves, but the appearances of those things that appear to my mind. Now, I said I'm making a dangerous proposition here simply because if we go deeper into Kantian thinking, we will find out that for the consciousness or mind, okay, for the Bewusstsein, there is no way of knowing whether there are really things out there or not. Okay? This makes the Kantian conceptualization of consciousness something encapsulated into itself. You know, remember that circular character of thinking, okay? Which cannot come out of itself, which can never come out of itself. Always and all the time remaining, staying within itself, okay? Now presents here in this difficulty in this way, okay? So all it can deal with are its own ideas, which means that one has to explain its structure, and Kant starts to explain it in his famous 1785 first version and 1787 the second edition, as far as I remember, of his famous first critique, the critique of the pure reason, critique of the pure reason. Okay, he wrote 3 very famous critiques. Okay, and you will see why they are called critiques. Okay, they are called critics just to criticize the earlier, whether empirical or rational understanding of the relationship between the mind and its objects. Okay. Now, for empiricism, you know, there was no problem. If you take a look at John Locke's writings, for instance, you'll find out that things are, or Bacon, for instance, the founding father of empiricism for some, okay, you'll find out that all you have to do to develop your knowledge is to observe and measure, okay, which is based upon the assumption that things are readily giving themselves to our understanding. Okay? So our understanding there understood as something quite transparent, having no effect at all on its own self. Okay? So it clearly can understand things as they are happening out there. Okay? Well, this was the proposition of empiricism. Okay? On the other hand, rational thinking now, reversing the problem, okay, enforced nature and God as well, okay, to act in according to a certain rationality to be able to establish the correspondence between knowledge and the affairs of the things outside of it. Okay. Now, therefore, these are called critiques. Now, he's going to develop a harsh critique against this supposition. And critique stands for this, actually, primary. Okay. The first step is to see that that mind, Bewusstsein, consciousness, is something encapsulated into itself. Okay. And its contents all belong to it and it alone. Okay. Now, first of all, of course, we have this sense that, we have the impression that when we think about it, we have the sense that, okay, some certain stimuli are coming from outside into my mind. Okay. I see you here, I see the light, the trees out there, okay. I engage in this or that kind of relationship in that society, all creating certain impressions in me, etc. Okay. So something outside here coming inside, okay. Well, forget about what stands, for the time being at least, what is outside. You know, causation, that outside somebody, for instance, the existence of you here in this class, causes me to act in this or that way. Held a lecture, for instance, here. Okay? If you are not here, if the class was empty, I was going to just come inside and take a look at the rows here and see that they were empty. I would go out. Okay? Since you are here, I am now here holding a lecture. Okay? So I can say that your being here is the cause of my holding a lecture here now. Okay? However, okay, to be able to understand you were here, first of all, I have to sense your existence. I had to sense your existence, okay? Let's start with this, okay? So the first component in the organization of or structure of consciousness, analytic structure of consciousness, if you like, is human sensibility, okay? We sense the things. Now, actually, human sensibility covers all the ground here. So when I write it down here, do not be misled, okay? Now, don't forget, here, within this critical philosophy, everything functions, every explanation brought about, okay, has to function according to the requirements and rules of understanding, okay? There is nothing outside of my understanding for my understanding. Okay, there may be things for my body, there may be happenings over there, etc. But as long and as far as these turn out to be questions within my understanding, this means that they are all in my understanding, and for the things which are not in my understanding for this or that fashion, okay, I would not be able to develop any explanations, okay? In other words, okay, I may not know, for instance, that there is a planet far distant over there in deep space, okay? But as long as it does not fall into my understanding in this or that fashion, you wouldn't be able to expect me to develop any explanations about it, right? Okay? So it means, in other words, within here, we are operating as far as our understanding goes, not as far as what we think, where we think the world goes, okay? As far as our understanding goes. And for our understanding, it appears that it starts with certain sensations, okay? Human bodily sensations, I mean, but seeing, hearing, etc., etc. Well, there is an interesting difficulty here. Contrary to Aristotelian unproblematized approach to the character of experience, okay, Kant problematizes the experience itself, and therefore he wouldn't call this immediate comings over into my mind as experience. Rather, they call them as intuitions. Okay? Intuitions, since now suppose at that stage that I do not have any concepts, I do not have any developed structure of consciousness, and I just have a body. Okay? What happens if you do not have a consciousness and operating and functioning or being alive only within your bodies? Okay? Now, it appears that you would not be able to discern one sensation from other sensations, simply because sensations, now for instance, I am standing here and I expose my body to countless numbers of sensations. Okay? I cannot count so many stimuli arriving at my body that I cannot even count them, and I cannot even classify them. Okay? Forget about the classification of the sensations belonging to hearing as different from the sensations belonging to seeing things, for instance. Okay? I would not be able to recognize even these sensations caused by seeing, hearing, tasting, or touching. Okay? So, in this, at that stage, this is not a stage, do not misunderstand me, okay? Left to the sensation alone, he calls it the faculty of sensibility, okay? Left to the sensation alone, the external stimuli, external is in quote, okay? The external stimuli supposed to arrive to my consciousness or my body would not have any meaning at all, okay? For instance, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the sweet and the bitter, okay? Simply because, as we will see, to be able to tell such a difference, one has to have the concepts of sweetness and bitterness, okay? Without these concepts, you would not be able to make any difference and any meaning at all, okay? So stimuli arise, but he says that, actually he goes very radical, okay, amok. He says that actually what we think to exist outside of our consciousness as time and space do actually belong to the structure or character of our sensibility. Okay? In other words, time and space are brought about by the functioning of our sensibility, which only accepts such stimuli abiding by its own principles. He calls them a priori principles of sensibility. Okay? A priori here meaning prior to any possible experience, earlier than any possible experience. So just being human and having a body like this, okay, puts us into such a structure. Okay? Maybe with other animals, the structure of sensibility may differ, but Kant is now speaking about the human condition, so to speak. Okay? So for human body, for any sensation to occur, these so-called supposed to be external stimuli are expected to present themselves in spatial and temporal forms, which means that any other stimuli which do not themselves in the form of spatiality and temporality, okay, cannot be taken by our sensibility. Okay? So such things, practically speaking, such things do not exist for us, in other words. Apart from the things that present themselves to our understanding in time and space, if you like, okay, do not exist for us. Okay? Simply because they won't create any affectuation in our understanding, or if you like, in our consciousness. Okay? But don't forget that the Kantian formula does not reject their possible existence in themselves. Okay? It only claims that they cannot exist for our understanding. Okay? They may be out there, just like that planet I was talking about, at far distant place in space. Okay? But as long as I'm not able to perceive or sense, having a sensation of that planet, in other words, such a planet will not exist for my understanding. That's what he means. Okay? So you gotta be careful. You know, by this, we are creating a separation between the questions of actual existence and the question of knowing, knowledge. Okay? Or if you like, adapting this problem into sociological framework, the actual existence of the people over there and sociological knowledge over here. We are creating a now gap, actually insurmountable gap, between these real, quote-unquote, real, and what is known. Okay? So then all those stimuli, so-called stimuli, you will see, okay, so-called stimuli abiding by the rules or a priori principles of my sensibility, therefore presenting themselves in spatial and temporal fashion or forms, okay, enter into the consciousness, okay. This is the process of, if you like, intaking. The conclusion will end up by saying that these may just be illusions as well. Okay? So, wait for this. Okay, now I am taking in. This, therefore, is supposed to be the world of appearances. Okay? For instance, I put my hand on this desk. Okay? I see this desk. I understand that I am not able to penetrate or pass through that desk. And I put my hand on the desk and understood that it is something solid. Okay? Something solid. Now, all I know about that desk are these sensations. You know? Okay? Nothing else. If you ask me, I can give that information that it is white, that it is having that height, that it's solid in structure, so on and so forth. Okay, having two drawers, etc., etc. Okay, all according to my sensations. Now this means that I do not have any idea about what this desk is in its own self. All my ideas about the desk, okay, are coming from my experiences of the desk. But we have not arrived at the desk. Now, these intuitions, unfortunately, okay, without being processed within the structure of understanding, as I said, are nothing. I won't be able to differentiate them from each other. Aristotle was saying, remember, okay, the actual experiences are transferred into form of representations in memory, and within the memory they have been classified according to the simple principle of their similarities and differences and so on. But I do not have the idea of difference and similarity. So how come I can organize them in my understanding? Okay? Therefore, according to Kant, I will try to explain this in another fashion, but I am putting it rather in a simplistic fashion. Okay. According to Kant, the consciousness, without having an a priori structure of its own, okay, would not be able to function. In other words, all these sensations arriving at the boundary of the consciousness are, in its formulation, nothing else than a manifold of a flux of intuitions. A manifold, a multiplicity, infinite multiplicity, whose contents are all intermingled with each other. Okay, so it turns out to be impossible to make any sense out of it. Okay, infinite number of sensations arriving at the same time to my understanding, and in a rather massive fashion. Okay, now. Therefore, he says, for this massive manifold of flux of intuitions to be organized, okay, the mind or consciousness had to have a certain structure, okay, and that structure had to be necessarily a priori. A priori, again, here for the second time I use the term, a priori now means prior to these incoming sensations. Now, as you may see later on perhaps, that is the absolute opposite of what the empirical thinking suggests. Okay? So, if our minds has a structure of its own, then only under these conditions, this manifold of flux of intuitions can be organized into something. Okay? Now, so that he locates at the very core of our consciousness a certain faculty again. He talks about faculties, you know. This was the faculty of sensibility, and now I am talking about a certain second faculty. I'm going to talk about a third one as well, okay? In between, okay, speaking of faculties, let me locate here the faculty of imagination, having different functions of its own, but at the center, the faculty of understanding. Okay? Verstehen. Now, we were talking about Bewusstsein. Within the structure of Bewusstsein, don't let themselves mislead by the term consciousness. When I say consciousness, you should always understand being aware. Being aware of one's own self, or its own, or of the things, whatever. Okay? We are talking about the structure of being aware. Okay? Now, understanding, strangely enough, for Kant, has its own structure. Okay? Actually, it has primarily what he calls a priori categories. Okay? If you like, mechanisms of thinking. Okay? This theory is called transcendental because the understanding itself, when it understands, does not know that it has a priori categories, for instance, and how its a priori categories function in its own understanding. Okay? So now Kant is penetrating into the very structure, therefore transcending, going beyond the active operations of understanding. Okay? Now, these a priori categories of understanding, what are they? According to him, they are established ways of thinking. Actually, he borrows his categories. He gives us 12 categories for the structure of understanding. He borrows his categories from the logic of his own time. Okay? Later on, he has been much criticized. Some saying that Kant's selection of categories was wrong. Some saying that actually only one, for instance, Schopenhauer would say that Kant was talking about 12 categories. However, only one category will be enough for all these, etc., etc. Some others saying that 12 categories are not enough, but we need 16 categories, etc. Not these categories, but other categories. So the categories themselves are not important, okay? For the reasons which we will later see as well, they are not important. But what's important for us that there are certain, if you like, established ways of thinking, just being human, okay, for human beings, in other words, there are certain established ways of thinking prior to any possible human experience, okay? So, human mind has a specific structure of its own, even though it may not have any content as experience, coming from experience. Okay? We will see later on that this will prove itself to be impossible, however. Okay? One should be careful saying these things. Okay, there are 12 categories. And don't forget, categories are not concepts. They are the ways of relating things. For instance, the most important category, for instance, of course, causation. Yeah, we were talking about causation. I was saying that it was David Hume who told us that perhaps the causation, the relationship of causation that we assume to be between the things in nature may belong to the operations of functionings of our mind. Okay, here we find it right inside the mind as one of the most important categories. Okay. There are other categories as well, categories of relationality, categories of comparisons, etc., etc., okay? Making all 12, 4 different classes, each having 3 subsets, therefore making 12 categories. Actually, you may think about these categories as within the Kantian framework, as the universal relations of logic, or universal logical relations, okay? Regardless of the conditions, for instance, comparison, okay? When I say inequality, for instance, P is not equal to not P, okay? You know, you can see this is a relationship of inequality, okay, arrived at as a result of a comparison, okay, or it has been, its other form is P is equal to P, or A is equal to A, okay? This is another, for instance, identity, the principle of identity it's called, okay? The other one as well, principle of relationship. Under every conditions, you know, for any P, this relationship can function, as you can see. Or for any A, the other relationship can function. I am, for instance. I am I. You are you. The desk is desk. Okay? All these propositions are necessarily logically true relations. Okay? So such kind of logical relations we are talking about when we say a priori categories of understanding. Okay? Cool.